Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 20th ever Highlight Haven interview. My name is Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by a very special guest. He is the host of Locked On Saints, a beat writer for LouisianaSports.net, and an analyst at WWL-TV. Let me welcome Ross Jackson to the show. It's great to have you on.
Hey, buddy. Thanks so much for having me on, man. Glad to be here with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate you coming on. And let's just get right into it. I just want to start
Yeah.
by asking when you first knew you wanted to work in the sports industry.
It's funny. I think I knew it before I knew it, if that makes sense. Because I had a whole career in theater before I ever started in sports journalism. But my mother tells me that when I was younger, probably about 15 or 16 years old, I walked into a room at one point, maybe it's a little bit younger than that, walked into a room at one point while she was watching a show, Everybody Loves Raymond. And in that show, Ray Romano, the star of the show, or whatever, plays a sports journalist. And apparently, I said to her at some point in my childhood or in my early teenhood that I'm going to be just like him. I'm going to be a sports writer too. I don't remember saying this, but apparently I did. And my mom has not lied to me before, so I don't expect that she's lied to me about this one. And so I guess then, but it's funny that I kind of disconnected from that. Went out and had this really fun, really successful career working in live theater all across the country, and then came back to it, I guess, at some point. And so that probably would have been in about 2017 to where I really made the big leap over to it. Obviously, I've always had an interest in it, but that's when I actually was able to finally make the leap over to getting that started.
And moving over to some Saints questions because obviously that's the field of your expertise. Today was obviously the NFL trade deadline, and it's
Mhm.
safe to say that there were a lot of big moves. One of which was the Saints sending cornerback Marshawn Lattimore to my Washington Commanders.
I was going to
Trade,
say.
that trade occurred just a few hours ago. What's your initial reaction?
Yeah, look, it's a move. The trade itself of sending Lattimore out is a move that we've kind of been tracking for the New Orleans Saints since about the offseason. There was a lot of noise around the idea that he might potentially be traded due to a fractured relationship within the organization. Ironically enough, that fracture felt like it was between Lattimore and former head coach Dennis Allen. Well, now they wait into the day after they fired Dennis Allen to trade Marshawn Lattimore away. And so, it just kind of goes to show you. But I think that really the thing that led to this trade wasn't a full on sort of, fracture between Lattimore and the organization. It's really not even about Dennis Allen getting fired. I think that it's has everything to do with the fact that the Saints are ready to rebuild and get everything started. So my initial reaction is that this is the beginning of the New Orleans Saints finally taking a rebuild seriously, and we should expect to see them continue to make more moves here over the course of going into the offseason and things like that. Obviously, trade deadline's done at this point, but curious to see how they mimic this or follow this up over the course of the next 9 months or so before they get started up again.
Yeah, and in that trade, the Saints received a sixth-round pick back from the John
Mhm.
Ridgeway deal, as well as Washington's third and fourth-round pick. How would you say that this trade impacts New Orleans' future?
Yeah, I think it gives them the opportunity to start building back through the draft, which is kind of what they need. This is a team that, if you look at the 14 teams right now in the NFL, as of the end of Week 9, that have players of 30 or 30 plus years old, the New Orleans Saints by far have more than any of those teams individually of the 14 that are set to make the playoffs. Players of Saints have 9 of those players. This is a team that needs to get younger, right? And so gathering more draft picks because now they have a first round pick, a second round pick, two thirds, and two fourths gives this team now the opportunity to be able to um, start to build through the draft, do the things that we've seen teams like the Washington Commanders, like the Houston Texans, like the Detroit Lions do in their pretty expedited rebuilds, if you will.
Yeah, and the Saints just came off a 23-22 loss against the Carolina Panthers. We will get into, I know you mentioned it earlier, but we will get into some of that coaching stuff later. But first, I
Mhm.
just want to hear your main takeaways from that matchup.
Oh yeah, I mean it was another game of self-inflicted wounds for the New Orleans Saints, and that's kind of been one of the kind of stories of the season here so far for New Orleans is that they've kind of been in that situation. You go back to the loss against the Philadelphia Eagles, a little bit the loss up against the Kansas City Chiefs. Their loss to the Atlanta Falcons was riddled with that, and then now you look at this Carolina game. This is a game that New Orleans should have run away with. This should not have been. A close matchup, and it certainly shouldn't have been a loss. But that has been sort of the telltale sign of the Dennis Allen era. The Saints lose to teams that they shouldn't lose to, but never beat the teams that they shouldn't beat. And that's typically the sign of a bad team or poor coaching, however it is that you want to look at it. But that's something that doesn't live up to the standard of what it is that the New Orleans Saints were doing. So I think all of that was encompassed in this loss to the Carolina Panthers.
And as you've been saying, Saints head coach Dennis Allen was fired after that game. What do you think this means
Mhm.
for New Orleans?
Yeah, it's a rebuild, right? It's time for them to get started. I don't know necessarily that you got to tear it all the way down to the studs, but you're certainly replacing the wallpaper. You might be replacing the drywall a little bit too. Kind of doing some things to kind of remodel the house a little bit. I think it's a lot of that, right? It's a lot of they get to go into a coaching search. Once they hire that new head coach, that head coach is going to have preferences in terms of who his coordinators are, who the position coaches are, who the quarterback is to an extent as well. I think those are the things that you're going to be watching out for over the course of this, and that's effectively what this coach firing kind of triggered as they move forward is the kind of getting started of entering sort of the new era of New Orleans Saints football. I think it shows you that the team has not lived up to the standard that it itself has set, and that they don't deem that as acceptable any longer.
Yeah, and obviously Darren Rizzi is stepping in as the Saints
Hmm.
interim head coach. Rizzi was hired as New Orleans special teams coordinator back in 2019. What are your expectations for him in this expanded role, so to say?
Yeah, just to help this team kind of guide its way through the final 8 games of the season and the evaluation process that has to happen. This is now a time over the course of these last 8 games that the team gets the opportunity to evaluate its young talent and figure out who it is that they want to build around as the older players start to cycle out. We expect some retirements over the course of this offseason, namely, of course, Ryan Ramczyk, the former starting right tackle, who slimmed down a lot, dealing with a degenerative knee issue that had sidelined him for the entirety of 2024. The expectation is that he'll retire this offseason. We'll see what happens with guys like Cam Jordan, Demario Davis, veteran defensive end, veteran linebacker, respectively, the veteran safety and Tyrann Mathieu, the veteran do-it-all player in Taysom Hill. Like all these guys are over the age of 30 and are at that age where if they wanted to retire, it wouldn't be a shock to anybody. And so I think those are the things that you're kind of trying to guide this team through at this point is just that evaluation process. I think the other thing that you get from Rizzi is that he's somebody that is kind of this hard-nosed, tell the truth kind of a coach who's all about accountability. And I think that's something that this team needs right now. Tyrann Mathieu told us the other day during his press conference ahead of Darren Rizzi being announced as the head coach or the interim head coach, excuse me, that some guys just need to be told how it is, basically, right? Just need to be told the truth, and they believe that Darren Rizzi is a guy that's going to be able to do that.
And I know on one of your more recent podcast episodes, you said that in terms of who the Saints could potentially be going after at that head coach position
Mhm.
next year, Ben Johnson should be number one on that list. Do you think it's a guarantee that the Saints do go after a new head coach, depending on how Rizzi does play for the remainder, or how he coaches for the remainder of the season?
Yeah. Yeah, I think no matter what, you're interviewing and opening up your coaching search, right? Like you're going to look outside the facility, you're going to do all that stuff because that's the responsible thing to do as an organization. You're never going to kind of move into just one direction. In fact, the Saints actually kind of made that mistake to an extent in hiring Dennis Allen. They interviewed a bunch of coaches, but everyone knew that they were going to hire Dennis Allen back in 2022. Darren Rizzi, by the way, a part of those head coach interviews back in 2022. So I think that Rizzi will get the opportunity to earn that job if he, let's say that the team finishes. I don't know, Matthew, it's too crazy. Let's say 5-3 over the course of the last 8, right? They do something wild like that, finish the season 7-10 off of a 2-7 start. That's great. However, that's not enough to solidify the job for anybody. It shouldn't be. You have to kind of go in and look outside the facility. I think 100% the New Orleans Saints are going to look outside the facility. They're going to look at what's unfamiliar. They're going to look at what could be uncomfortable for their organization in a positive way in terms of upsetting or changing things. I think all of that is necessary at this point, and that's what you should be looking to take advantage of when it comes to this rebuild. This is your opportunity to change everything from what you once were into what you have the potential to be.
And as you mentioned, the New Orleans Saints started off the season 2-0 with dominant wins against the Carolina Panthers and Dallas Cowboys, scored
Mhm.
40 plus points in both of those games. Since then, they've gone on a 7-game losing streak. Were those first two games just a fluke, in your opinion?
I think that they were a couple of examples of games in which everything went perfectly for the game plan. Where I think the New Orleans Saints have run into the most trouble is that they have not been able to adjust to adversity. When what they initially come in planning to do works, they can steamroll. And I think that's what you saw the first 2 weeks. But then you saw the Philadelphia Eagles adjust. You saw the Atlanta Falcons adjust. And then you also saw the Saints shoot themselves in the foot against the Atlanta Falcons. I think once those things started to come up to where they couldn't manage the adversity, that was really the big issue. So I don't know necessarily that the first two games were a fluke, but I do think that those first two games were perfectly aligned for the Saints to do what they did. Their biggest challenge, and this comes down to coaching, is their inability to adjust under adversity.
And as right now, with the 2-7 record, the Saints have less than a 1% chance to make the playoffs, assuming no miracles are pulled off. Where do they
Mhm.
go from here? You
Yeah, I
you
think.
already mentioned that rebuilding process, but, like,
Mhm.
what specific direction do you think they're heading in?
Yeah, I think that's going to depend upon the head coach that they hire. I think to be more specific about that, though, the Saints should be looking at one of two things: either a head coach that doesn't call plays, a head coach that is just a head coach, or an offensive play caller at head coach. In today's NFL, going for the offensive play caller at head coach is a wise move because if you go for the offensive coordinators calling plays, and that offensive coordinator has a solid season, he's somebody's next head coach the next season, right? And so you're having to constantly cycle through offensive coordinator after offensive coordinator after offensive coordinator in today's NFL. So it makes more sense from a longevity standpoint to hire a head coach that is an offensive play caller. So I could see the Saints going that route, but I really see the value in having a head coach that is the figurehead head coach while the coordinators handle the play calling responsibilities. It's hard to keep those coordinators in the building with the coaching turnover these days. But I think that that's where it starts. And then after that, you're building everything else around the vision of that head coach. The direction they need to avoid going in is the plug in kind of rebuild head coach, right? Hire somebody for 2 years to manage the rebuild, build the culture, keep the culture together while we go through the rough patch. And then once that product is then finished in terms of its rebuild, then sell that sort of solid foundation or already rebuilt roster to another coach to come in, thereby creating more inconsistency. I think you have to bring somebody in that you think you're going to be comfortable with, ideally as an offensive play caller or not a play caller at all. In today's NFL, you probably want the offensive play caller and that you can be patient with, which is on the organization. And I'll tell you, if there's anything that this New Orleans Saints front office and organization has shown, it's that they are willing to be patient. So I do think that that's a good setup for a young coach, a 30-something-year-old coach, a Liam Cohen, a Joe Brady, a Ben Johnson. Although I think Ben Johnson will get better offers than the situation that the Saints have to offer. But I think that that's the direction they have to go. They need to be ready for a multi-year rebuild process. And if they hit a little bit faster on that a year early, like the Lions did, like Washington is doing, like Houston has done, great. But otherwise, you're letting everything come to you as opposed to chasing everything else down.
Yeah, and if the season ended today, the Saints would have the third overall pick in the 2025 NFL Draft. Let's say they stay around that range. What is New
Mhm.
Orleans' biggest position of need that they should go after?
Yes. There there are several positions they go after. Wide receiver, offensive line on the interior as well as on the outside. They could look at a future quarterback. They could go cornerback now that they've traded away Marshawn Lattimore. They could look at their defensive line. The issue is that this draft class isn't super top heavy with what the Saints need most outside of wide receiver. And so for me, I think wide receiver is a spot that makes a lot of sense that aligns with this draft class. Guys like Teteroa McMillan, guys like a guy like Travis Hunter out of Colorado. Those are the players that kind of make sense at the top. They could go offensive line too, but with the way that this offensive line class, if the draft were tomorrow, is set up, is you're really not out of the top tier of the offensive linemen going into the top of the second round. You can still get very solid offensive linemen at that point. And so if you can grab yourself a playmaker that effectively helps you build the car around the quarterback that you eventually plan to plug in as your long-term option, then I think that there's value in that. But in terms of need, the Saints can kind of throw a dart at this point and they'll hit something that they could that they could draft.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on potentially a new quarterback there a little bit.
Mhm.
Derek Carr, 33 years old, and then I believe Spencer Rattler was a third round selection. But I
5th.
mean, fifth round, okay, fifth
Mhm.
round selection. Their third pick in the draft, though.
Mhm.
Um, but when you look at it, I mean, of course, you want your rookie quarterback to develop into a guy that's more than just a solid backup. Do you really see him, turning into a potential starter for them in the future?
I think he has the tools to do it. He has the raw tools to build upon. You just need somebody that's going to be able to develop him. Now, the Saints have a really fantastic quarterback coach in Andrew Janoko that is a very good developer. So perhaps they can do that, but it's a bigger question than just the Spencer Rattler portion of the equation. Do you have the offensive system? Do you have the offensive coordinator? Do you have the head coach? Do you have the quarterback coach that creates sort of the most adequate environment that inspires development, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I think that when you look at the potential of a future head coach for the New Orleans Saints, that you could be seeing a look at a head coach that is a quarterback developer, a QB whisperer type, right? A guy like a Liam Cohen who just got really or has gotten really solid play out of Baker Mayfield. Ben Johnson, of course, and what he's done with Jared Goff to go back to him. I think that there's value in looking at that. And so I think that Spencer Rattler could be somebody that you look at as a potential to develop. But I will tell you, I don't think, and I've said this for a while now, that Spencer Rattler and Jake Hayner, the two young quarterbacks that the Saints have, Spencer Rattler, the rookie, as well as Jake Hayner being the second year guy right now, that the two of them won't be and shouldn't be the only quarterbacks that end up being in the conversation of Derek Carr's successor. I think they should find another option to include in there, whether it's a veteran or whether it's another young quarterback that they grab in the draft. And for the Saints in their salary cap situation, having a starting quarterback on a rookie contract would help them a great deal.
Yeah, and I mean, this upcoming draft is stacked at the quarterback position. You got guys like Milrose, Shador Sanders, Cam Ward, all potential options. So it'll be interesting to see where they go there. And then the Saints' next matchup will be at home against the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons are on a roll, having won 5 of their last 6 games, one of those wins coming against the Saints. What's your expectations heading into this one?
Go in, compete, evaluate your roster. I think that's the biggest thing. Now, I think that anybody that is a Saints fan should be at least still hoping for a win because it's the Atlanta Falcons, the bitter rival of the New Orleans Saints. There's no doubt about that. But I think in this one, it's about can you go out there and show up for Darren Rizzi, circle the wagons around Darren Rizzi, the interim head coach, and go out there and maybe try to start him out with a win or at least looking more competitive than you have against good teams in the past, right? That game against the Los Angeles Rams, they were never really in the conversation. The game against the Kansas City Chiefs, they were in spitting distance going into the fourth quarter, but they were still outplayed up against the Atlanta Falcons. They shot themselves in the foot, so on and so forth. So some of those include Derek Carr at quarterback. Some of them don't. You can look at it however you want, but I think that that's the big thing that this team has to do is show up, be ready to compete, and then start evaluating your players. I don't think there should be any expectation about wins, losses, anything like that for the rest of the season. That's not what the rest of the season is about anymore. It's can you find the players that are your foundation for your future? That's what the focus has to be on. But hey, look, if you can start off Darren Rizzi's interim head coaching career with a win against the Atlanta Falcons in New Orleans, certainly worse ways to get your tenure started.
Yeah, and in terms of being at least somewhat competitive, the Saints have allowed
Mhm.
1.3 rushing touchdowns per game this season, which is tied for the third most in the NFL. What's going to be the key in order to contain Bijan and Tyler Algier on Sunday?
Yeah, they need a complete kind of they need to play a game looking like a defense that they haven't looked like in probably the last 2, 3 seasons is what they would have to do. So it's a lot to ask, particularly on the defensive interior. I think, for instance, former first round defensive tackle from last year, Brian Brzee, last year's draft out of Clemson, very talented pass rusher, very disruptive player up the interior, has not been solid in the run game at all. And we knew that about him as he came into the NFL, that that's where he would need to develop. However, he has not shown that development. The Saints' interior offensive line in particular has been weak, and the defensive line as a whole in the run game oftentimes gets moved off the line of scrimmage or pushed back off the line of scrimmage as opposed to being able to advance to make plays in the backfield. They have to mitigate all that. I think a lot of people will point to missed tackles. It's really not about the missed tackles for me when it comes to the run game. For me, which sometimes some plays certainly are impacted by those missed tackles. Don't get me wrong, but I think the biggest thing is the lack of push on the defensive line, and then some of the errors and issues that you've seen so far with the second level, the linebackers filling their run fits. I think you have to be a little bit more fundamentally sound in that area. We'll see if Darren Rizzi, Todd Grantham, the defensive line coach, can get them there.
Yeah, now I do have one final question before we wrap things up. If
Yeah,
there
man.
was one piece of advice you could give to an aspiring sports broadcaster or journalist like me, what would it be?
Yeah. The best advice that I ever got was to not wait for any safety nets, just leap. And that was actually advice that I was given in terms of my pursuit of my theater career, but it has ended up helping so much. I was a 10-year theater veteran, Broadway, off Broadway, national tours, all of it, did all of it, was the artistic producer at a high level theater in Los Angeles, was in Hollywood, all the stuff. And then I leapt. I leapt and I went to sports journalism because I fell in love again, and it filled my heart. My heart filled my soul. It fulfilled me. And so when you run into something like that you love, just leap. Don't wait for any safety nets. The safety nets will show up. You have a good support system. If you've got family around you, you got friends around you, people will take care of you. Until then, just keep leaping and don't stop leaping until you can't leap anymore or you don't want to leap anymore because you're happy with where you're at. So that's my big thing. Leap. Don't wait for any safety nets. Just go.
Yeah, and with that being said, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I really do appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up?
Keep tuning in to my guy right here, Matthew Heisman. I mean, this is what we're doing, right? This is what we're all about. We're about you. That's what we need to be telling people. Keep tuning into you. Go check all the rest of them. I'm episode 20. There's 19 episodes before this. Go watch all of them. Go check them all out. That's my message. That's my message. Support Matthew Heisman. That's my message.
Really appreciate the support. Make sure you follow Ross Jackson at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter. Make sure you also subscribe to Locked On Saints on YouTube. With that being said, again, big thanks to Ross Jackson for being the 20th ever Highlight Haven interview guest. And as always, we will see you next time.